Hi, everyone. Thanks for
Recording
joining.
in progress.
I'm Becca Ricks, a researcher here at Mozilla and your host for today's panel. We have an amazing discussion planned for today as part of our MozFest Dialogues and Debates series, which today will be focused on the intersections of labor justice, AI, and tech. So internet platforms have created this new ecosystem of on-demand services managed by apps. Uber and Lyft drivers are managed by apps, on-demand translation services, DoorDash deliveries. And what's more, companies that are building AI rely on a vast network of on-demand workers to clean and label data sets, train and improve models. And some of these on-demand workers, like Mechanical Turk, are used to perform different short tasks. This has resulted in work that's precarious, temporary, unstable, and workers aren't always protected by traditional labor rights. And during the global pandemic, as more people are turning to gig work to make ends meet, these issues have become even more urgent. I'm delighted to be joined by three amazing panelists. We have Dr. Lilly Irani, a professor at UC San Diego. Dr. Irani investigates the cultural politics of high-tech work practices with a focus on how actors produce innovation cultures. We also have Rida Qadri, a PhD candidate in urban information systems at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Rida studies the experiences of platform work within non-Western spaces. And finally, we have Sherry Stanley, who is a lead organizer at Turkopticon, an organization that enables Amazon Turk workers to talk to one another. Turkopticon helps the people in the crowd of crowdsourcing watch out for one another because nobody else seems to be. One last thing before we start, we are taking questions for this panel in real time. So if you're on Twitter, tweet those questions at Mozilla with the hashtag dialogues and debates. And with that, I think I'm ready to get started. I wanted to start with a little bit of framing. So the gig economy we know emerged historically at a time when the global labor market was becoming more flexible and companies decided it would be cheaper to transition from working with full-time employees to short-term contractors. But the experience now of on-demand gig workers has changed over the past few years with new advances in tech and AI. So I wanted to start with you, Lilly. Can you tell us a little bit more about what new types of labor, cultural work, or knowledge work you're seeing emerge?
Yeah, so when we think about AI, we're kind of taught to hope that there's going to be these magical technologies that are going to have general intelligence or are going to be able to make associations between concepts based on, all the data crunching that Google is going to do on all the text we produce on the internet. But actually, AI needs a lot of help. So specifically, there's something called supervised machine learning, where an algorithm learns based on data sets that are already kind of pre-classified. So for example, if you're trying to make a machine learning algorithm that was going to classify, actually people have examples of this in your life. Like if you're trying to log into a website and you get those reCAPTCHA things that are like, please click all the bridges or please click where all the traffic signs are, you are actually doing this new form of labor because you are helping an algorithm learn the difference between a picture that has a bridge in it and a picture that doesn't. It's not only images though, there's also audio transcription, so audio algorithms that can kind of pick words out or do things with human voice, they need workers to actually listen to the audio and then go segment the audio into chunks. There's also work that's about bridging the algorithm out into the real world. So sometimes on Amazon Mechanical Turk, I've heard of tasks where workers are asked to go out to like a grocery store and take pictures of products and take pictures from different angles so that the computer can better learn, how somebody who's shopping in a store later using this algorithm will also take pictures from different angles, and the computer needs to understand that. But I think a lot of the conversation in the last decade of this has been a lot about both like what Mary Gray has called the kind of last mile of artificial intelligence, and then specifically focusing on platforms. But it's also useful to think about this as like complex data supply chains. One example that came up in conversations I was having with some folks Sherry knows, it was rev.com. Rev.com is a site where people can get their audio transcribed. So Rev has their own platform where they have audio transcription workers. And then also Rev will then take those audio transcriptions and the audio file and chunk them into little bits and send them to Amazon Mechanical Turk, where Crystal, an organizer with Turkopticon that I know, had actually had the job of evaluating those transcripts. So this is not just about the labor that powers AI, although there's tons of that. It's also about the labor that kind of gets treated like AI and gets organized in ways that make it hard for workers to work together or to know who their boss is, or they're giving up a lot of fees to platforms who take chunks of their wages. And that's the situation where we're looking at changing. Just to give one last example, Crowdflower is a crowdsourcing company that hired workers on platforms like Mechanical Turk to actually look at drone video footage and to look at the drone footage and say, like, is that a truck? Is that an SUV? Like, segment it into human meaningful objects. So this labor is also going into like technologies of war and killing, which is a big part of the economy.
Thank you. One of the reasons I'm really excited about bringing the three of you together in conversation in particular is because all of you are involved in either studying or actively building sort of labor resistance for gig workers. So I wanted to talk a little bit about resistance networks and why are resistance networks so critical to a healthy functioning society? And Rida, I think if you want to kick us off with that.
Yeah. So I think it's important to recognize that, of course, power is not equally distributed, and nowhere is that more clear than in tech development, where a select few are sort of able to design tools and center their needs and assumptions into the algorithmic mainstream and shift the risks of algorithmic failures disproportionately on to workers whose now livelihoods, as Lilly was talking about, and Shari will talk about, whose livelihoods depend on these systems working. So I think it's absolutely critical to figure out ways how to redistribute this power, how to confront it, how to transform it, and that's where resistance networks come in. But I think there's two questions that come up when we talk about resistance networks. One, what kind of resistance is truly transformative? I think so. A lot of my work has been in Jakarta, looking at platform drivers, resistance networks in Jakarta. And I think they've sort of proven that since their behavior is part of the feedback loop of the algorithmic systems that learn from them, they can actually transform the systems in very particular ways. As Lilly was saying, it's their labor that underpins the system. And the drivers in Jakarta, for example, have resisted the spatial dynamism of the platform by creating spatially anchored stations that sort of mimic the traditional offline markets and have forced the platform to adapt that into their business models. And this also goes to sort of speak to the earlier question of what you were asking about different types of work and tech work. I think it's also important to consider to think about resistance, we have to think about how the type of tech mediated work changes across different geographic contexts. So platforms actually do adopt very different practices and business models in different areas, sometimes to skirt regulation, but sometimes as just a response to local market conditions and practices and consumption patterns. And so in Jakarta, for example, we've now seen, as a result of both resistance from drivers, but the local, kind of algorithmic failures in the local market, the launch of something called Grab Now, which is basically offline matching. It's like a street hailing model. So at Grab Now shelters, drivers will wait in a queue. There's a dispatcher who manually assigns drivers to riders. So it's the exact opposite of what we assume the life of a ride-hailing driver would look like, and also the opposite of what platforms promised to deliver to us, right? They promised they'd free us from the inefficiencies of anchored taxi stations, but they've really gone back to that old model in Jakarta. And I think that's important to look at, because the form that the resistance networks will take will depend on the existing institutional context and the context of work. So I think James Scott has this wonderful phrase that's like, form of resistance is also shaped by the institutions of repression. And often workers choose resistance network forms which are able to respond better to their conditions and the trade-offs they're willing to make. So, resistance networks won't look the same everywhere. And the reason I bring that up is because often the resistance of the subaltern or particular segments of the world have been dismissed because it doesn't match certain standards of the right way to resist, or what we have been trained to see as resistance. So I think those kinds of both the forms and the reasons of resistance are important to consider when we think about resistance networks.
Yeah, and I'd love to think a little bit too around and talk a little bit about Turkopticon, which is, I know, a project, Sherry, that you work on, and it's a tool to help gig workers, Turkers, Amazon Turk workers collectively organize and talk to one another. So Sherry, I'd love to learn a little bit more from you about, how was the platform initially developed? What problems were you seeing? And what are some of the things you've learned along the way in this project?
First, I would like to go about, Turkopticon started as a review site. It started with Lilly, Irani, and Six Silberman, and they were students when they actually started it. And Lilly had been reading about some Turk stuff, and she was like, "Hey, Six, this is messed up. These people ain't getting paid. Why ain't they getting paid? Why ain't nobody stopping it?" And they had sent out a couple of hits, which is that's what we call our work, is hits, and that's human intelligence tasks. It's everything that a computer can't do. So Lilly had sent out she had sent out her first task that she sent out to Turkers was to write a haiku. And it had came back, her results came back, and it was just like, "Please pay me. Please don't reject my work." That's where it started out at. And then that's when they went ahead and they made the review site, and they ran it for over 10 years. And let us vent, scream, whatever, we had some guidelines, but, it was the one place at the time that Turkers could come and say, "Hey, we're not getting treated fairly," and that's how we got to, that's what led to now, though, is it never really changed. We could go there and scream to the mountains, and it was like, okay, who you screaming at? Who's going to ever do anything? Machine learning wouldn't be possible without us. We're the hidden labor that allows, researchers like Jeff Bingham, Chris Callison Birch, they take, all this money from these grants and things, and they say they're helping Turkers or they're building this, but we don't need nothing built no more. Like the building, that's when you build something so much that all it is an outsource. It's not like really a solution to the problem. Then that's when Lilly had put out a call. She had said, some things about, she wanted to shut Turkopticon down because it really wasn't, she wasn't doing the change she thought that she wanted to. And then we started out with a few Turkers, and Lilly was like, stand up. That's the only way. And yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting kind of what you say around, we build this tool hoping that it will do something, and then you realize it requires a lot more work, a lot more thick networks, a lot more sort of organizing around that work, and it's a journey. I know we're going to be talking a little bit later around this idea of scale, but I wanted to talk to you, Rida, a little bit about your research on gig workers in the global South. And I know specifically you mentioned your research is around mobility platform workers, so folks like Uber and Lyft drivers. We just talked about some of the challenges that Turkers face. I would love to hear a little bit more about, what are some of the distinct challenges that drivers face, and specifically, how are they going about building digital labor collectives right now?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear Sherry talk, because in some ways there was a lot of very similar experiences that drivers in Jakarta had. So on one hand, there were a lot of algorithmic failures that they were facing because a lot of the assumptions that underpinned the platform sort of blew apart when the platforms were introduced in Jakarta. There were problems of maps not working very well, routes being completely wrong. There's a lot of traffic. And at the same time, platforms were disrupting some very powerful incumbents in the existing mobility space, so specifically what they call offline motorbike taxi drivers. So, drivers were really the face of that disruption, and they were at the receiving end of the violence and, not being able to enter certain areas. And at the same time, technology was also changing the spatial scale of work. So whereas earlier a lot of the motorbike taxi work was organized around the neighborhood, this was no longer true. So a driver from West Jakarta could be completing orders in areas of East Jakarta that they knew nothing about. And so they recognized that, they were the face of disruption, they're facing an unfamiliar system, and they really need help. But to understand how drivers responded, we need to understand, I think, two important things. And this goes back to my point about resistance networks also being deeply contextual. One, in Jakarta, as with a lot of other cities in the global south, there is a deep culture of mutual aid because your survival, especially in particular classes, is tied to networks and reciprocal relationships. These drivers recognized that, as with many other cities in the south, formal systems don't work for what drivers call children of the street. This idea that, as Shari said, no one is going to save us but us. So this started resolving a lot of these problems through mutual aid and volunteerism. And what started as groups of drivers meeting at public spaces while waiting for orders has now spawned into these thousands of interlinked communities across Jakarta that have an ambulance system and an emergency response system and thousands of WhatsApp groups and very fast moving information networks. But the form that this response also took, so there's, this kind of very kind of radical idea of volunteer-based mutual aid that is underpinned by language of deep solidarity and kinship. So drivers call each other brothers on the road. They say we might not be family, but we're thicker than blood. And we have, this is sort of our soul calling. This is the purpose of our lives, is to help each other out. But also the form that they took, the form of association actually came directly from the existing motorbike taxi market, where most of the drivers were initially working, and they were organized around spatial stations. And so they've carried this form of kind of spatial meeting spots and transformed them into what they call base camps that have really become, these are these DIY shelters where drivers meet together and hang out and trade information. So all these relationships are not just online. And these base camps have really become anchor nodes in this web of relationships that covers the entire city really now. And these base camps both are spaces of organizing, but are also spaces of just chilling out and kind of like a clubhouse, getting to know each other. And I think that kind of has like a circular, it kind of feeds back into the desire to help each other out, because both you kind of, it has a practical purpose of giving you rest and letting you charge your phone, but also like a very deep organizing purpose, which is something that I think is not necessarily present in a lot of organizing networks of ride-hail drivers, because it's sort of so spatially, it's supposed to be so spatially dispersed. So drivers in Jakarta have really resisted that spatial dispersal of their own networks.
Rida, when you're talking about that, that's like, we have the exact opposite though, because we have to organize in public. If our forums or anything, our reviews, they're public. Anybody can come and see when we're complaining and things like that. And that's where we come into issues there too, because then, if you leave a bad review, then you've got a requester saying, oh, you can't do that. That's, and it seems that, and we're all over the world. So it's so hard so we use our forums to try to get that solidarity and build on it, but it's so hard because it's everywhere. And that's, yeah, like you were saying, it's, we join up, we talk about, the work we do, we talk about the bad requesters, all of that, but it's so hard when our forums are open and we don't get any privacy, because requesters will come in and they'll go back and say, oh, this Turker said this is so horrible. But I mean, honestly, Turk work ain't that bad. I mean, it's bad, but I raised 3 kids on it. I wanted to be sure to point that out. I've done this for 6 years. I really love to Turk because it did, like you guys say, it did give me the flexibility. I got to go if my kids had something to do at 2:00 in the day. I didn't have to say, oh, I have to call off work to come see you. I had that flexibility, but then the trade-off, like Becca was saying earlier about trade-offs, the trade-off was sometimes at 2 a.m. I was woken up because the work was there and you had to get up and do it. I mean, and a lot of people's like, oh, you didn't have to. Maybe I didn't, but, feeding my kids, I kind of had to do. So I just wanted to point that out that, yeah, the forums is that like for us, but it's so hard because of the privacy of people just jumping on and being like, oh, because it's public, we can use it. And no, please. That's all we've got.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. Oh, just in terms of what Turkopticon was before, like Turkopticon is this website where people could write reviews. It was kind of built on this idea that of mutual aid. Like, I had actually put up after the haiku that Sherry talked about, I had put up a task on the platform that was like, what would you want to be a Turker's Bill of Rights? And wage theft was one of the things that, like, there are a lot of things Turkers did not agree on, but one of the things that they agreed on was, people could just like not pay for my work and keep it. And that's actually still a problem today, to Sherry's point, that like like being able to share that information with other workers kind of helps some workers avoid what had happened to some worker out there. But that first worker who wrote that review and said, this guy took my wages, like that worker still got hurt. And like, that's what we need to change. But there are all these forums where Turkers were mutual aid and chatting and chilling. And that's what Rida's description so reminded me of that. But then, and we'd hoped that the website could be a place where people across those forums could help each other out. And to some extent they did, but what's become really clear to me in the last year, watching how Sherry and the other Turk workers who have turned Turkopticon into an organizing kind of organization, is like, that has to be done through human relationships, through taking the time to build trust and build conversations across. And that's the kind of thing that AI will never do. Like, an AI is a brittle piece of computer code that's optimized for some patterns of text or image that we produce, but you can't hold an AI accountable. You can't hold, it seems clear that we can't barely hold the companies and the institutions that use the AIs accountable, but you can hold the person-to-person relationship accountable. And that's how people take risks together to change things. So that's why what Sherry and others have been doing is so important. And mutual aid can be like the first space for, building that accountability and surviving.
Yes.
Which is not nothing.
Yeah, I feel like what's interesting about this conversation is we're bringing some of these different forms of organizing or different forms of resistance and dialogue with one another. So I know you just mentioned like mutual aid networks. I know one of the things we've been talking about is sort of at what scale are these networks operating at? Mutual aid networks, for example, a lot of them are necessarily local and they're very much tied to a very specific place or community or job role. And so I'd kind of love to hear from you about how you think about scale in the work or the networks that you work with, and what some of the advantages are of working small, but also how do we then build collective movements that reach the scale that is needed to effectively, confront companies or confront different labor practices.
Yeah, I mean, I can start with this question. So I think in Jakarta, drivers have thought about scale in 2 ways. One is expanding in the organization system in a way that you're sort of creating a more centralized system and subsuming local chapters under different hierarchies. And I think that's sort of the traditional way of thinking about scale. But there's another very interesting way to think about scale is replicating similar structures in different places and joining them together in a more horizontal relationships. So they recognize that small neighborhood groups are important, Becca, as you just said, because you want to respond to local emergencies, you need to respond to neighborhood dynamics, enter into relationships with local shopkeepers and the sort of surrounding urban fabric. And as Lilly was saying, build these kind of deep human relationships that do require a smaller scale, I think, to start with, and that in-person meeting component. But at the same time, drivers recognized that it was important to scale across the city and cover it in this network of mutual aid and interconnectivity, because as drivers are circulating in the city, they could need help anywhere, right? So on one hand, we think about ride hailing or platform work as sort of not spatial, but it is in this case very spatial, because drivers are going from one end of the city to the other, and they could have an emergency anywhere, and so they need to be able to go to that node and require help from, or have someone to call to in any part of the city. So I think drivers have used both a franchise-based model to achieve that, where they have attached themselves to larger associations, take their names, help with resources, and then you have sort of a central committee and a representative to the central committee, and a more coordinated response, and you could have that across the city. But another interesting, I think, way of scaling has been to create these friendship associations between communities of different neighborhoods, which mean you you're friends, you help out each other, but there's no impact on decision making, and you help other drivers set up base camps and communities in different parts of the city, because they recognize, of course, effective response to be mounted, you need scale. And in terms of confronting the platforms, these communities, because now they have thousands of members and are so interconnected, hold a lot of latent political power, and they have been able to get the attention of the platform, and we can maybe talk about that later. And platforms have done a lot of outreach to communities, and there's a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of, but a lot more open communication or lines of communication between the driver communities and the platforms in a way that I definitely have not seen like Uber or Lyft have with their driver communities. But I think that scale was very creating that scale without diluting the identity and power of the neighborhood level group was very important to creating that political power.
I could jump in next. I mean, I think one of the everything Rida said, like that, that is really beautifully explains, the challenges of having those rich personal connections, but also being able to kind of confront the platform or confront like being able to help a worker anywhere in the city. Another example that I think about when I think about this scale problem is, we were trying to figure out how to sustain Turkopticon as a project. Turkopticon, this review website, we first thought like, well, maybe basically solidarity between tech workers in different parts of the industry with Turkers has been a really important part of our organizing strategy as it's come up. One of the reasons is that, we were trying to teach, some front end coding, so to empower Turk workers to autonomously maintain the website and make their own decisions. And I came to realize that people who know how to code and maintain a full stack website, they've had so many years of educational resources and time made available to them. And we live in a society where that investment of kind of coding education is really expensive to get. And only, Jane Margulis has written about only how wealthier public schools even have that as an option. So, like at one point, there's kind of like the scale of a society and what kinds of capacities people have the time to develop, and, where do you get those capacities when you need them to organize a movement? And so part of that was for us to think about, okay, let's think about tech workers as a movement, and how tech workers who are working at engineering jobs who want Turkers to be treated better, how can they engage in solidarity work? So we kind of had to like scale up in some sense how we were thinking about it. Or today, Sherry has a donate here link on her background, and we're trying to fundraise to pay for the time and the resources that Turkers need to organize for themselves and to develop their own networks to be able to articulate what they need. But we're launching this as a campaign where we're trying to get other tech workers in solidarity to donate resources. And the idea is, AI is this huge, it's an industry where some people are making 7-figure salaries, and then some people who are absolutely essential to the production of AI are getting a very small proportion of that. And so part of scaling up lets us see an argument about how the value that's being created in this industry is not being distributed fairly at all. And then kind of this fundraising campaign is a way to remediate that. So I think sometimes scale also lets us like see selective ways where it makes sense to reach out and find the connections that our group that needs something changed has to other people who also maybe want to see something changed, or are benefiting from the oppression of others in the system, but maybe are willing to kind of act against that. Yeah, so those are the scale thing is really abstract, but those are some examples that kind of got me thinking about from the organizing that I've been part of.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because I think one of the things I've been thinking about too is sort of the ways in which we tend to center the technology or the tool or the platform. And I think one of the lessons I'm hearing from you around Turkopticon is that it's one thing to build the platform, but unless it's really organized by workers themselves and they're really actively involved in the creation of these networks, it's just a technology. So I'd love to hear from both of you around, why is it important that these tools or these networks are organized by workers themselves? And what are the limitations when, technologists or tech companies kind of try to create them, or try to create tools?
Sherry, I feel like this is like, I know you're bursting with so many things to say on this topic.
Oh, when you talk about tools
Fire.
and researchers and academics and tech companies, they're all like, oh, we're building this, we're going to make it great, and you're going to love it, and just come join us. And you get all involved in it. And then you're like, then guess what? Their project's over. And then you know what? We're left with nothing. They're like, oh, we've got some money. See you later. We've got our papers. We've got our technology. We've made our Alexas. We've made our Google Home. We don't ever get, because I've sat, and this is no joke, I've sat for days before and recorded myself saying, hey, Google, or hey, Alexa, or any of them. And it was just like crazy how that I built all this, or I helped build it, we built it, and you never hear about us, like never. And it's crazy to think that when I sit back and I'm like, dag, them devices cost big bucks, and they can't even pay me more than 5 cents, because that's how much you get paid per task. That was the pay then. Yeah, I mean, you could make you could make money. I will say that. They did pay. But I can remember sitting for hours and hours and hours on end, and it never, ever been like, hey, Mechanical Turk workers. Yeah, some do, but not very many people know us.
Can I also jump in with like some on the academic, because I'm an academic, and so maybe I can do some gentle calling in on my people, because one thing that Sherry and I have talked a lot about is projects where academics come in and say like, oh, we want to build a tool to make Turking better, to upskill Turkers so that they can build a career and get to a higher paying job. Or here's a tool that will make it easier to find jobs that, pay them more or something. And a pattern that ends up happening is that, because they have money from this grant, like some Turkers will work with them and help them out. But one, like the grant runs out and there's no money. Like we don't have like a public funding strategy to fund technology that people actually need. Like for some reason, at some point in our country, we decided that paying for libraries to keep the lights on and have toilets and be full of books and desks was like an investment we were going to make. But we don't have any kind of ethos of that for like public kind of computational technology. And so it's all on, get the grant to make the innovative idea, and then it peters out. And then like who's left holding the code, for like the investments workers have made, and like they're kind of putting their times and aspirations into, say, that like academic project or that short-lived activist project. Like another problem is that because like workers will get pulled into these like one-off projects, like they'll get kind of held up as like, look, we're talking to workers, but actually like the broader base of workers like aren't, haven't been consulted. Like there isn't a sense that, this is something that a lot of people want or addresses like a lot of different people's needs. Like there's such diversity among Turkers, diversity in where they politically identify, diversity in terms of like people with all kinds of different like abilities and disabilities, like life experiences, careers that they've had and knowledge that they're bringing in. Like there's nurses, there's teachers, like there's all kinds of people doing this work. But like those technologies are not an expression of a coalition that can then like get together to kind of maintain the technology and to like make sure it's doing the thing that they needed to do, or to advocate to like find resources to sustain it. So those are some of the problems. As somebody who like built a thing for 10 years and did not know anything about organizing and went through all the cycles of kind of, burnout and frustration, like I think that a lot of how we build technology for people mostly makes people into kind of sources of information to inform the tech design, but we don't build technologies that can actually be sustained by people, for people, and kind of like all their diversity of kind of needs and viewpoints, and the valuable kind of contributions they make to like making that technology mean anything. I don't know if that made sense. Like I kind of went off on that.
Yeah. I know one thing as well that we've kind of talked about a little bit offline is this idea of algorithmic failures. So this idea that, as complicated as tech companies might claim their AI systems are, the reality is that often technology is just really bad at like understanding and approximating knowledge, and is actually like a very poor replacement, as you were saying, for local knowledge and ways of knowing. So I kind of want to put it out to each of you, what is it that computers can't sense or can't do? And what happens when they try to? Sherry, I feel like you might have a story.
A computer can't feel. That's what I keep thinking about, is like we do a lot of emotional picture labeling and things. Does it make you feel happy? Does it make you feel sad? Does it make you feel this? Does it make you feel that? And then that's where we come into a lot of algorithmic failures, because researchers use, or companies use, if you fall below this threshold of how much you agree with this picture, then we reject you. So that I think about, computers can't tell you how you feel. And I think about AI can't, break down words to tweets to tell that, how they're profiled. Because we read tweets and we tell, if they're racist or political, or, we've done all of it. And computers can't do that. We already know computers get that wrong a lot. And that's where the humans have to come in. And that's where we have to stay, we're Turkers and we got to stand up. Somebody's got to see us eventually. I mean, we've been hidden all these years, but I know it's Amazon, but when's the time to say enough's enough and we all deserve to be treated equally, humans?
I can also like add to this. I think from the context of cities around the world, I think something that I think about often is, of course, there's sort of all these algorithmic failures, as Sherry was talking about, and blind spots of technology. But I also think about blind spots of the tech designers. So in the global south, sort of a lot of homegrown startups are, and they get a lot of legitimacy because the founders are from the countries where the startup is going to be launched and where the platform is going to be launched. Unfortunately, though, a lot of these homegrown startups are trying to replicate this ethos of Silicon Valley, of people from a very particular class and education background and gender can envision something in a boardroom and apply it across the world without any frictions, without really even investigating whether they're responding to actual pain points or they're responding to just kind of their narrow ideas of what pain points are. And so if you look at even the kinds of technology and startups that are being funded in the global south right now, a lot of them are these kinds of startups to create more convenient on-demand consumption, very similar to where I think even like Silicon Valley was a couple of years ago. And so we're kind of seeing the replication of a lot of those. I fear that we're going to see a replication of a lot of those societal implications of trying to insert technology into everything without care of consequence, and whether the solution that is being presented is even appropriate in a city like Jakarta or Lahore versus a city like Boston.
Yeah, Rida, what you're saying kind of makes me think about how a lot of technology companies that pretend that their secret sauce is about the AI or like their amazing price surge algorithm, like it's really just about automating a middleman and then branding the middleman with an experience. So like Uber, Uber wasn't even the first kind of, I think like Uber wasn't even the first kind of like app-based dispatch. I think taxi drivers in San Francisco actually had an app for dispatch, but I think what I remember when Uber was first starting in San Francisco was a lot of middle-class people saying like, oh, I feel so awkward about tipping, and Uber's great because I never have to tip. Like, and Uber sort of, for that kind of way that it regulates the experience and it puts its brand on it, and then it takes a huge cut out of what drivers do. So I think sometimes we need to kind of take the emphasis, and even artificial intelligence. I really liked also, Rita, how you said like inserting this technology in our relationships, because I think a lot of times that's what artificial intelligence is like actually about. It's about automating some kind of intermediary relationship, whether it's your relationship with your doctor, or whether it's your relationship with the caseworker, or a relationship with the police. And those relationships are deeply problematic in ways that movements have been talking to us about. And putting the algorithm in there kind of makes it takes the agency of like where you would kind of confront and resist maybe as a person away from like you and the police officer or you and the caseworker, and it puts it out into a call center or out where the algorithm is, like in some centralized like company where they don't have a customer support line like at all. Virginia Eubanks writes a lot about that in automating inequality. It's like algorithms are just moving the mistakes into an IBM call center that's much harder for people to fight. Or like think about like getting your insurance claims denied because you've been tagged as potentially fraudulent, like what you have to go through for that. So it's not so much about what AI is, like in some ways what AI can't do is like kind of by design. Like companies like that AI can't get all that context. They like that it won't cave as much if somebody pushes back and says, no, this is wrong. And that's kind of part of the point.
And that it sort of makes invisible those frictions by shifting those frictions onto someone else or somewhere else, as you said.
Yeah, I think the term Virginia Eubanks uses in that book is empathy override. It's this idea that like it doesn't matter how, at the end of the day, they might not care how accurate the algorithm is, but if you've sort of offloaded decision making and responsibility to a machine, like then you yourself aren't really responsible for it. So yeah, it's super interesting. I wanted to ask one last question before we get into a little bit more of a discussion, and hopefully if some questions come in from Twitter. In the past few years, there's been a lot written about this, and people are starting to talk about this a lot more. And there's some really bright spots. So we've seen movements like the Tech Worker Coalition with a lot of big tech companies as a tool for organizing. Tools like Turkopticon, as you've been talking about. We've seen sort of these new forms for organizing emerging. So I'd love to hear from each of you, what trends or movements or things are you seeing today that give you hope for this movement? Rida, would you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I think the increasing recognition that there are these diverse forms of resistance that exist to the technology and platforms, and that platform or technological outcomes are not a given. That there is that the kind of apocalyptic world of the technology is not necessarily a future that is, it's a future we're constructing. It's sort of happening. It's not sort of already preordained. And that worker power and mutual aid can be radical and transformative even at smaller scales. But something that I hope to see a little bit more about in this discussion is more of a recognition that solutions to mediating precarity of workers need to be more inclusive, as Shari said, of the worker experiences themselves, and of diverse regulatory context, particularly, sort of experiences in spaces where the labor regime and work, experiences of work and institutions of repression, as I said, are not the same as they are in the US. So I hope that we are able to kind of think more broadly about some of these solutions and sort of shed some of the universalist trappings that I think a lot of discourse, at least in the US, falls into by virtue of the fact that, of course, like so much of the technology is being developed here. But, as Shari said, Turkers exist all over the world. So any solution or any organizing or any advice that's given to them or their forms of resistance that are recognized need to recognize their individual contexts from all over the globe.
Can I add to that? When you talk about that just brings me back to where I first started with all of the organizing with Turkopticon. We have international workers on our committees that are doing this work with us. I don't want nobody to feel like, because it is all of us all over the world. It's not just US workers. And I know that gets a lot of, but there's a lot of issues that I was like, okay, it's got to be all of us. It can't just be because they're getting, the same treatment we are.
Mm-hmm.
You can't stand up by yourself. You have to stand up in solidarity. So yeah, when you're talking about that, I was like, yeah, you got to have the international, you've got to think of it broad picture, not just here at home. It's got to be, especially when we're all working on the same platform together, even though we're not in the office together.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not, we don't see each other every day, because there's hundreds of thousands of coworkers that I've still not got to, and I'd love for them to reach out. Like, seriously, anybody that wants to reach out, I'm open. My email's open. We'll get on the phone, whatever, because I want all Turkers to be felt represented for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess one point of inspiration for me, I mean, you mentioned I have many points of inspiration, like Turkopticon and like Sherry's work and Crystal and Alex and Phil and all these folks, like they inspire me, like Tech Worker Coalition inspires me. But an example I wanted to give was the farmers' protests in India, where you've got like 500,000 people who for over, I think, a month or a couple of months now have been protesting around the perimeter of Delhi, protesting government policies that would subject workers to basically a lot of market volatility in the price that they would get for their crops. and then in an agricultural economy where they already are kind of dealing with being burdened by loans for fertilizers and seeds and things like that. And the reason why it's inspiring to me is because, I mean, like I think there's like 300 different farmers organizations that have come together to that have these daily meetings to figure out how they're going to, they speak different languages or from different regions. And then they're coming together and figuring out like how they're going to adapt their tactics to what the government is doing. Another reason why it inspires me is I actually have a friend in India who is organizes with the Communist Party there, which is a major party that wins elections in places like West Bengal and Kerala. And the Communist Party is also, involved in the organizing, but they're not the cause. Like it's such a huge movement that like it shows that lots of different kinds of people with different kinds of, say, political ideologies can come together with force to kind of analyze a situation and target something that they want to respond to and change. And then the last thing that kind of my friend had, Rida Krishnaswamy is my friend's name. The last thing my friend had kind of shared with me was that, like a lot of the Marxists in that Communist Party, when they would do their analysis of who is going to be in solidarity with who, they had seen small landholder farmers as kind of the class enemy to the workers who are working on the farms actually doing the picking. But in this movement, those small landowners and the day laborers and people from like Dalit castes have actually come together. So zooming out to tech, like I wrote a paper 6 years ago called Difference and Dependence Among the Digital Workers, and I was like, look, you have tech workers who are programmers and they're making AI, and they actually benefit from the exploitation of Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. So we shouldn't assume that knowledge workers will in some way like be in solidarity, or flexible knowledge workers will be in solidarity. But I think that that was wrong, but not because you can assume that they will be in solidarity, but because around certain issues and with certain kinds of organizing and with certain kinds of reframing to change how we understand like our common conditions, they can be brought into solidarity. And so that's why, you have tech workers for tech workers helping fundraise for Turkopticon, because, like Jacob Von Dihi, an organizer from San Diego, said, like MIT is trying to automate the work that I do as a coder also. And so, this automation that's going to try to like divide our jobs into tiny little chunks that are convenient for the automator, like that's a process that's coming for all of us. So that gives me a lot of hope too.
Can I just quickly say, just jumping off what Lilly said about, this kind of process coming for all of us. I think this is also why it's so important to look at the experiences of and have a deeper engagement with conditions in the global South, not just because the global South is sort of like this world that's out there, but a lot of the employment relationships that are now have been experimented with in the global South are now being pushed into the mainstream in the developed world. And I think there is a lot to be learned because of that, from solidarity practices and resistance networks in a context of fishing and informality and precaritization. So as Lilly said, it's sort of we always think about a lot of these experiences as separate, but these changes are experimented on with one population, and then it's sort of exported to other populations. So I think that's why these kinds of cross-geographical and cross-class and cross-industry solidarity networks are so important.
This actually
when you talk about, okay, sorry.
Oh, go for it, Carrie.
I was just going to say, when Rida talks about that, I think about, we're going up against the mammoth Amazon. So when you say Amazon, it's like everybody's like, so that's where the solidarity has to come from for us, is because, we are scared. That's what took me so long to be able to speak up about the conditions, was because the fear is real, like 100%. Because Amazon can ask you and they don't have to tell you any reason. Like it's all privacy policy, blah, blah, blah. I thought, yeah, my teenage kids give me better answers. Sorry. They don't answer very, very little. The least minimal that they have to answer is what they answer. And I just wanted to be sure to, put that out there that, yeah, it's when you think about it, it's got to be a whole mass, we got to get in solidarity to go up against companies that big. When you think about, Bezos, what's he made? What is it? 4 million a second or something like that. They was advertising, I heard. I know it's probably not the correct, and please don't quote me on that or anything, but yeah, I know he makes millions and
Millions.
Yeah, millions, and Turkers, we don't see nothing of that, I promise you. So, okay, sorry. A little fired up.
We do actually have a question that came in from Twitter that I'm going to ask. So it's a question specifically around the global pandemic. And they were talking about how a lot of people now are relying on sort of AI powered services like maybe DoorDash or delivery. And so they frame it as with the pandemic, some of these platforms that use AI have been very useful for us. So what is the balance between protecting workers and also customers?
I'll just jump in. I see, Sherry, you're like, okay, I'm gonna say one thing. Like, I don't think those are AI powered services. Like when I lived in Delhi, like I could walk out to the corner and there'd be a taxi stand, and then I could find a taxi thing. Like this is just a website that like substitutes for the taxi stand. These are human powered services. I think that's the thing that we learned with COVID, that some people are, I don't know, like I was reading something the other day. There's this amazing article. It was about somebody who was working in a grocery store during the pandemic, and they were just talking about the ways that like we've chosen to organize our society in the U.S. is like the people who have to do the essential work for a living get to take on all the disease risk. Like we could imagine organizing a society where we cooperate in shifts to do essential deliveries. Like I'm in a mutual aid network in San Diego, and for people who can't go out because they're immunocompromised or they don't have a car, they need food, whatever, like we organize it in shifts. Like it's not the person who needs the money the most that goes out to deliver the groceries. It's like everyone has a shared obligation. So I think it's not about balancing the needs between the worker and the customer. It's about everybody taking more shared responsibility and more shared vulnerability for the care that we know we have to have as a society in order to survive. Sorry, that was a little ranty, but Sherry.
And then you're going to lead right into me, Miss Wordy over here. Yeah, when I think about that, I'm like, okay, if you're having to use us for your AI, is it really, like Lily was saying, like, okay, I understand, we're the ones powering your AI. But when you think about how to protect us, it's all about that. You got to make sure that you pay fairly, and you treat the workers with respect, treat us as humans. Don't think of us like as you plug in some numbers in Amazon and they're spitting some back at you, because there's some humans are running around in there that's, spitting that back to you. It's not just some computer spitting it back to you. I promise it's not. You might think it is, but it's not. And when like that Rita and Lily has been talking about, it's about that mutual aid. If you're going to, support Turkers and you're making a profit off of us, then, give back to us. Donate. Do your part. Don't sit and talk about it if you're not going to step up. That's the thing that I've seen the most, is so many people keep saying, oh, poor Turkers, poor pitiful Turkers. But when it comes to actually, stepping out, there's very, very few until now, that we're actually getting organized. That's a big part of this, is that we're actually getting organized and learning and, building that trust and that solidarity. So yeah, that's me. Is, if you want to support us, don't just retweet us or follow us or something like that. And yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Can I just jump onto that really quick? Like, yeah, and I fully agree with what Sherry said. And the person who asked, I actually want to thank you for like posing the question, because it is a really important question. It's on everybody's mind right now. So there's some concrete places that you can donate on that specific case of kind of delivery stuff you talked about. Is Gig Workers Collective is a gig worker organization where workers are organizing for better conditions. Like, for example, with COVID, they were trying to get companies to provide them with PPE during the PPE shortage, for example. And then also Rideshare Drivers United, for people who are kind of driving for Uber and Lyft, is also a worker organization that has pushed for amazing policy changes. And so, yeah, like what Sherry said, and those are a few concrete places for that case that you named in the United States. If you are in the United States, I should not assume that.
Thanks. Well, we are kind of at the end of our panel, so I just wanted to thank the three of you for an amazing discussion, an amazing rich discussion. Thanks, Mozilla, for organizing this and MozFest. But thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for this amazing discussion.
Thanks, everyone.